Okay, hi everybody. It's 1 o'clock on Monday, and so it's time for Pirkei Avot Halacha v'Hashkafa. I know that I promised last week that we would discuss the question of that. We're talking about the Mishnah in the first chapter of Pirkei Avot, Mishnah 16. Rabban Gamliel Omer, Rabban Gamliel said, he was wont to say, Aseh lecha Rav, make yourself a rabbi, or appoint yourself a rabbi or a teacher, Vistaleg min hasafek, and avoid doubt, and don't do your tithing through estimations. We've discussed at length the question of the teacher and the importance of a teacher, and we've started to discuss the questions of doubt. We started last week talking about halachic doubt, and we're going to continue that today. I had hoped actually to move over to the questions of doubt and faith, and whether that's a legitimate religious category or not. But I really want to continue discussing the question of halachic doubt just for today, because it's most appropriate for Pesach. I think that's the reason I want to push it. One thing I will say for the members of the Tel Aviv International Synagogue, it says, "Aseh lecha Rav v'stalek min hasafek," choose yourself a rabbi and avoid doubt. So therefore, you can go, and you're welcome to go flood Rabbi Constantine with questions. That's what he's there for. That's what rabbis actually like to do. I mean, I'm sure he's like that also. We like to get questions. We like to give answers in halacha. So that's that. Okay. My point of departure today is a by the way comment that was made in the early 19th century by Rabbi Chaim Volozhin. Rabbi Chaim of Volozhin was the founder of really the first yeshiva in the sense that we know it. Houses of study, of course, and circles of study around great rabbis have existed for forever. I mean, it's for time immemorial. But the modern yeshiva, the modern school, which is not attached to a community, but rather self-sustaining, self-governing, and basically sets its own parameters and own vision, that's a modern invention. That was invented by Rabbi Chaim of Volozhin in 1802. He was a student of the Vilna Gaon, and he tried to apply the Vilna Gaon's educational philosophy in this school. And from there, the model of the yeshiva took off in the Lithuanian world, and later in the Hasidic world, and in the Mizrahi world. But the aim hayeshivot, the mother of all yeshivot, in the modern sense, is actually credited to him. In any event, he wrote a commentary on Pirkei Avot, and on this mission he says as follows. A very short comment. Aseh lecha Rav, choose yourself or set up for yourself a rabbi. Lish'ol mimenu, to ask him al davar shemistapek lecha, whatever you have a doubt about, whatever you don't know. Ubazet tistalek ma'asafek, in that way, you want any doubts, you want any problems, you want any questions, you'll have a straight answer. He's talking about halacha here. He's not talking about. I don't think he's talking about beliefs and philosophy. Ve'al tomar, but don't say she'ein tzat tzarich l'rav. Don't say that you don't need a rabbi. What do I need a rabbi for? Ki kol davar she'yistapek lecha. Anytime I have that doubt, I'll do without. When in doubt, do it. When in doubt, leave it out. That's usually often the doggerel which we invoke when we talk about halacha or Jewish law or traditional Jewish life. We'll say I'll be machmir. I'll do without. I'll say it's aser. The amar, and that's why the Torah says no. Al tarbel laser umadot. Don't do things like happenstance. Don't do things approximately. Don't do things the way you think it should be or it shouldn't be. You go to the professional and you ask and answer. In other words, this is 200 years, more than 200 years, before Dr. Rabbi Google. Rabbi Chaim of Volozhin is saying, no, no Rabbi Google. You want to be an informed questioner and do your homework and know what you're talking about when you ask a question. If you're capable, that's fine, but don't do it off the top of your head. I was sort of taken by this comment of Rabbi Chaim Volozhin because it's Pesach, and we're allowed to have Pesach. Yesterday was Rosh Chodesh Nisan. Everybody in their own way is getting ready for the holiday, which will be a little bit less than 2 weeks from last Friday, from last Saturday night. Sorry, it's a little bit even crazier this year because Erev Pesach falls on Shabbat. So we have to get ready for those people who are those people living in Israel. We have to be prepared for 2 days worth of celebrations and food by Friday. And in Chutz La'aretz, the punishment that people, I guess we call it, people living in Chutz La'aretz have to be ready for 3 days. It's very stressful. Maybe it's a good reason why that Shabbat afternoon there's nothing really to do, because there's not that much to do because you need to rest. Anyways, and there is a general tendency to be very, very, very machmir on Pesach, and that brought me to think about or to talk about the question of Humra, of always being strict, of always leaving things out, of always saying things are bad. Now there is a wrong or prohibited, and it ain't as Sportenlike would say, he ain't necessarily so, and that's what Reb Chaim and Volozhin is saying. If you ask a rabbi, sometimes it'll be this way and sometimes it'll be that way. You don't always have to. We're not an ascetic religion, and as Rav Ovadia Yosef used to always say, "Kocha de Torah adif," that if you can allow something and not allow something for the same difference, you might as well allow something. Nobody's here to make the lives of Jews miserable. Now there are plenty of places where that happens, and a lot of the time it happens, unfortunately and unnecessarily. I'm not going to editorialize about this. I published on this in the Jerusalem Post. I published in Yedot Achronot. The recent court decision about conversion is a perfect example of a difficult situation which need not be as bad as it seems. But that's another conversation. In any event, but on Pesach we have a tendency to be very, very machmir. Don't touch things, and we can't eat this and can't eat that. Especially this is when Ashkenazim get crazy because, oh my God, we can never eat Qitniyot, and the Sephardim get to eat Qitniyot, and there's no restaurants to eat and there's no place to go, and there's an organization that arises every year called the Qitniyot Liberation Front. Those of you who don't know Qitniyot are that there's an Ashkenazic practice not to eat legumes not to eat legumes on it was this peas and beans and stuff like that on Pesach, because, well, some question as to why this happened. The best explanation of why Ashkenazim don't eat Qitniyot is because Qitniyot are rich in nitrogen, and in the Middle Ages, and this goes only back to the Middle Ages. It does not go back to Chazal really. In the Middle Ages, the way that they used to cultivate the fields, the wheat fields, was that they would have everything on a 3-year cycle, and so you would have four harvests per year, 2 harvests per year, spring and winter. You know about spring wheat and winter wheat, and you would do that twice. You would do that over the course of 2 straight years with 4 harvests. But wheat has a tendency to exhaust the soil in terms of its chemicals. So the practice developed to sow on the 3rd year the wheat fields with legumes. Legumes are full of nitrogen, and they sort of restore the soil, so you can go back to raising. Wheat. Why is this important? Because legumes. Because when anybody has any experience gardening knows that if you switch plants, that you can never really, unless you change all the soil. But if you've been planting X, Y, and if you have X and X for a certain number of years, and then you plant Y, there'll be remains of X left that'll grow together with the Y that you put in. So at the same time, wild wheat would grow together with the legumes. So when that happened, people harvest legumes, and there was a serious chance that there would be wheat grains that had grown with the with the peas, with the beans, whatever the case might be. And that, if you cook it with water, becomes chametz. So it's not an imminent threat of chametz, but it was common enough that a lot of people actually got very nervous about it, and they stopped eating it. And this has happened. It starts in Germany. sometime in the High Middle Ages. I'm sorry, in the Central Middle Ages, the 11th century, 12th century, something like that. In any event, so Ashkenazim don't eat that, but that's a lot of stuff. That's a lot of things that we don't eat, especially since corn oil and people have expanded it to soy, all kinds of stuff. And the Sephardim never accepted, the Mizrahi Jews never accepted this Humra. And since the majority of Jews in Israel, even if if they're Ashkenazim who are not as observant, will eat, will eat whatever, and the Mizrahi Jews will eat most of them will eat Qitniyot. Now some of them don't. So it's just that's what you do. So you find that Ashkenazim feel especially restricted in this regard. Why? But the motivating factor behind this fear of maybe there's a little chametz is very simple. I mean, so we say, so all right, so fine. What could happen? So I'll have a little chametz in my food. What happened? So the answer is that for reasons again that you can ask Rabbi Constantine. This is not for me to get into right now. The Torah chose to place the prohibition or the severity of the prohibition against eating chametz during Pesach on the same level as the most serious of all sins. It's like Sabbath desecration or eating in Yom Kippur or even sexual crimes. I mean, all kinds of terrible things. Now, because it's so, why is it so serious? This, as I said, you can ask Rabbi Constantine. But it's a fact, and since it's a fact, people go out of their way to avoid it more than anything else. There is no other. When we clean before Pesach and then we have b'dikat chametz, that's to get rid of. That's because you might even haphazardly nash on some kind of piece of chametz that you found. So that's where the severity of the of Pesach comes from, and sometimes the chumras, the strictures that come up are really kind of pretty amazing and pretty extreme. But it all comes from it. What we say, it all comes from a good place because of this desire to avoid chametz because of its severity. Okay, let's put this aside. But I want to talk about the question of chumrah per se, or the question of doubt per se. What does he say? Don't find a rabbi, and don't just always be machmir. Histalek ma'asafek. Stay away from doubt. Now, as I told you last week, one of the things about doubt is that you're not sure that you know. Pretty obvious. But that also assumes, I suppose, that there is a truth to know. Okay, otherwise you'd just be a skeptic. Some skeptics say there are no truths, and that's much of the society that we live in today, that there are no truths, or that you can never know. Okay, which really raises a deeper question, and that is there such a thing as halachic truth? In other words, there are so many arguments. There are so many differences of opinion. How is it possible? How is such a thing possible at all? I mean, God gave the Torah to Moses, and it was passed on, and so how is it that the custom is to fight, the custom is to disagree? How does such a situation? How does such a situation arise? So I'm last at the end of at the end of our share last week, I presented to you the classic Sephardic position, which is there really is one truth. There's only one. Every Jew should really observe the exact. Every Jew who wants to be religious or observant in a traditional sense should really observe the same way, because there's only one. Kel emet natan lanu Torah emet. God. There's one God. There's one Torah. So therefore, there should only be one psak halacha and shalom Yisrael. It would be a lot more monochromatic and maybe a little bit more boring, but at least we would fight less. Although Jews would probably find other things to fight about. As I mentioned, also this was the position that was advocated by Rav Yosef more than anyone else. And so how did machloket happen? Machloket happened, controversy happened, difference of opinion happened because A, God stopped God stopped revealing himself. Revelation and prophecy went out of the world, A. And B, so there's no way of getting a direct line. And B, the rabbis at some stage of the ball game didn't do their homework. The Talmud says in Tractate Sanhedrin that the students of Shammai and Hillel in the generation leading up to the Second Temple, it's an appropriate time for chaos, really didn't study properly, didn't study enough, and they didn't know what they needed. So they started arguing about all kinds of things, whereas there was very little argument before that, says the Talmud. However, once that situation of argumentation and lack of agreement and lack of knowledge of what the Torah really is saying took hold, it became permanent. It became permanent. So in other words, it's a bad situation because there is really only one truth. So we do the best we can. We decide according to the rules that the Torah itself gives by majority, or we decide to follow the greater rabbis that are smarter. I mean, there were ways to try to reach some kind of accommodation, some kind of resolution, because you can't live in doubt. You have to do something at some stage. And obviously, as Rabbi Chaim Volozhin would say, you don't always have to, or really shouldn't always be machmir. You should see what the things say, and maybe sometimes it's allowed and sometimes it's not allowed. But you do the best you can with an aim, with an eye to trying to come as close to the truth as possible. Okay. Now, but ultimately, everybody should strive for uniformity. And that's the reason why that all of the major codes of Jewish law were written by Sephardim. They were written by Mizrahi scholars because they sought to bring order out of chaos. And Rabbi Yosef Karo, in the introduction to the big work that was the predecessor of the Shulchan Aruch. Shulchan Aruch really is just a sort of an abridgment, sort of monarch notes on a larger work which he called the Beit Yosef. He says, I don't know, we're in a terrible case. He says, we've been exiled from all kinds of places. He himself was exiled from Spain in 1492. He says, and it's not like we have 2 Torahs. It's like we have 1,000 Torahs. That's impossible. That's terrible. That's terrible, and we have to try to minimize doubt as much as possible. We have to minimize that because we look terrible. Because how is it that we can say that this is elu ve'elu divrei Elokim chayim? These and these are both are sides of the words of the living God. That doesn't. It either is right or it's wrong. And if we're doing things that are wrong, we have to strive to undo that. Okay, so that's the Mizrahi position. So here, doubt is because there is something to know. There is truth. There is truth. We don't know what it is. We have to strive to try to reveal it as much as possible, even though we won't get a final word for it, at least to the best of our knowledge. God's not going to tell us yes or no in the immediate future. The opposite position, or a contrasting position, let's say opposite. A contrasting position is presented by the Ashkenazim. This may go back to Eretz Yisrael, ancient Eretz Yisrael. It may not. It's not. I'm not willing to take a stand on that. It's a very controversial position, very controversial question among historians. But it's true of Ashkenazim. That's all we need at the moment. The position is presented nicely, dafka by a Spanish scholar who lived in the 14th century. His name was Rabbi Yontef ben Avram of Seville. Seville is a city north of Barcelona. He's known as the Ritva for the name of the first letters of his name. And he when he encounters the statement in the Talmud in Eruvin, page 13b, that when it comes to Shammai and Hillel, for example, or Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel, that both sides are right. These and these, both sides are the words of the living God. So he says, what? That's like the old joke. He doesn't have the joke. It's the old joke about the 2 guys that come to the rabbi and the rabbi, and they have an argument, and the rabbi listens to one guy, says you're right, and listens to the other guy, says you're right. So the rebbetzin comes in and says, wait a minute, that doesn't go. You can't both be right. So she says, you're also right. He says that doesn't go. How does that work? So the Ritva quotes a resolution or explanation of this very troubling and very enigmatic statement in a midrashic collection, a rabbinic collection of homilies that dates from Eretz Israel, probably in the 9th century, although it has earlier material in it. And the story, and the midrash tells the story that Moshe Rabbeinu went up to heaven, and he gets up to the yeshiva Shalmala. The rabbis imagined that God also runs a yeshiva, and they're all learning Torah up in heaven. And on every single question that they would come up, the students, the angels basically, would divide 49 to 49 on every single question. There was never a determination. And every single position was just as legitimate and just as good as the other one. So Moshe Rabbeinu looks at God and says, what? I can't, how am I supposed to function like this? The angels can't come to any conclusion. What do you want from me? Never mind me. I'm, Moshe Rabbeinu. What about, I'm going to go give this to the Jews? Can you imagine what kind of make out of this? So God says, that's fine. Elu ve'elu divrei Elokim chayim. Both sides are right. Both sides are right. However, I give you the power by force of tradition, by force of majority rule, to determine what will be the proper ruling for you. And that is as if I said that's the right one for you right now. In other words, as opposed to the Mizrahi point of looking at this, where there's a right and there's a wrong, in the Ashkenazic position, they're both right. But but rabbis, or the Chachmei HaMasara, the sages of tradition, have the authority to determine which one is going to be applicable, and their decision is binding. That's part of the system. Now, how that works is another. I can give you a whole course on that. It's not for right now. But there are rules, clear rules, how that works. But that doesn't solve the problem. Here you have a situation where I have doubt because they're both right. It's not that I can't know. I can know very well, but I just don't know which one to pick. And the fact that this is given over to me, I mean, how can something be right and not right? How can something be permitted and be forbidden? How can something be pure and impure? It doesn't work. Just logically. So here actually, it turns out that the differences between Ashkenazim and Sephardim on this point are rooted in a very deep-seated and long-standing difference of opinion among logicians. That's an important point to keep in mind. In other words, the point over here is as follows. Is it possible for opposites to coexist? The usual way that we look at things is commonly associated with Aristotle. I'm not saying Aristotle started it, but it's commonly associated with Aristotle. So does end logic, meaning that something can't be A and not A. You got to pick. It's one or two. It's either right or it's wrong. There is another approach to that, however, which is very characteristic of Talmudic thinking, and which is represented in Ashkenazic thinking. They didn't realize that this is going to be that the Greeks also had the same argument, and that is something called multi-valued logic. It's a term that I learned from the late Professor Baruch Brody, who's one of the great ethicists, medical ethicists, and philosophers of the previous generation. He passed away not long ago. When I had the privilege of spending Shabbos in his home, and he explained, I'm not a philosopher, so this was he was amazing in terms of being able to teach me how this works. But there are systems of logic and value systems where you can actually have opposites coexisting. So you really can have elu ve'elu divrei Elokim chayim, as long as, let's put it in the halachic context, as long as the way that you go about interpreting the Torah and using the tools of interpretation and employing the traditions that supplement, the oral traditions that supplement the written Torah, you can create a position which is legitimate. Now, it might not end up being chosen. It might not end up being accepted by majority rule if we're talking about the Sanhedrin, or by common practice or by legal consensus, but it's still valid. It's still valid. So as a result, okay, now that's the case. That means that there's no room for histalekmas, a fake. There are two types of things. First of all, you'll never have any one last bottom line for the simple reason that there is no bottom line. All opposites converge in God, and that's a matter of faith, I guess. That's number one. On the other hand, um, excuse me. On the other hand, it also means that you're never aiming towards finality. So that's why what happens is that whereas Sephardic, I mentioned Sephardic and Mizrahi scholars always aim towards a bottom line and towards unity. The Ashkenazic halachic tradition is actually characterized by anarchy. Everybody's okay. You're right. You're right. Everybody's right. I mean, that story about that story about the rabbi and the two litigants and his wife. Only an Ashkenazi could tell that story because a Sephardi rabbi would say, "No, you're right. You're wrong." I mean, and that's it. The And that's the reason why. Up until the modern era, I don't like to use this word because it's a much abused word, but I can't think of a better word for it at the moment. The Sephardic, the Mizrahi, the Ashkenazi approach to Psak was far more pluralist than the Sephardic one, which is kind of funny because we usually say, wow, Sephardic rabbis are much more humane and they're much more open and they're much more flexible than Ashkenazi rabbis who beat down the hatches. And that's true today. It's not so true up until the modern era. What happened? Now we come to Humra, and we're also coming up to the end of the shir, so the timing is good. Many things happened in the run-up to modernity, to our day. But one of the fundamental differences between Sephardic and Ashkenazic rabbis and poskim, and why Sephardic rabbis tend to be much more makel, although they can certainly be machmer and seriously machmer on a lot of issues, is that Ashkenazi rabbis had to deal with modernity, and they had to deal with reform and conservative, and they had to, and they felt themselves very much under siege and under attack, which they were, and they were losing people because modernity took many people away. And their response was, and this is true to a significant degree today as well, and the response was to batten down the hatches and to hunker down and play bunker. If those of you know soccer, it's a straight game of bunker. And as a result, even options that are legitimate halachic options were not used because it might lead to a slippery slope, which is there. There's a slope and there's slippery. The question is, when do you apply it, when do you not? But so that encounter with modernity, which was very paralytic, ended up upending the sort of open as go with the flow kind of Ashkenazi position, which was classical. Now I'm being oversimplistic here. Sephardim didn't go through that, at least until they came to Israel. They the Jews who lived in Arab countries lived in a much more organic and integrated and non-self-reflective religiosity, and they were able to go wherever the Torah told it to go, and there were no sort of policy issues few policy issues that inhibited them. So as a result, in that regard, even though in theory Mizrahi Psak is more restrictive because you're looking for a result, and you're looking for the result. You're looking for the truth rather than the a truth. In practice today, since they're not affected as much by this feeling about of being under siege or being threatened, there's a lot more openness and a lot more willingness to be not to be machmir, not to leave things out, let things go where they may. So that's the end of this disquisition about doubt and rabbis and truth and halacha on this Mishnah. Next week we will talk about questions of belief. Hopefully, we'll talk a little about Pesach as well. As far as I'm concerned, we will have a class on Chol HaMoed. I will check with Rabbi Constantine to make sure that's that's going to actually happen. I hope we're getting close to herd immunity, guys. Anybody who hasn't gotten their shots, get your shots. Believe me, the world is opening up, and it's very much better than staying home. Trust me. I managed to sit in a cafe last week, and it was amachaya. So go and if you haven't gotten your vaccines yet, please do. Those of you living in Chutz La'aretz, same way, but do it according to the rules. Every state, every country, every province has its own rules. And those of you who are living in Italy or in places where you're still in quarantine, hang in there. There's light at the end of the tunnel. Yabba Seder. It's going to be okay. All right. Bye, everybody.